So before we get into today, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to ask me any questions about your group project or what you should be doing on it. Anyone in class have a question? No? Are you guys on track to finish by Friday? Okay. What about you guys online? Any questions? No? Okay. Yeah. So keep in mind that you do need to contribute to your group project. There is now, as of yesterday, right after this class, your group survey is posted. When you turn in your project, you need to also complete the survey. You can actually go ahead and complete that too. So if you want to do it before you turn in your project, that's fine. But that is where you will rate and basically grade your other group members. So for example, if somebody didn't do anything and you couldn't get into contact with them at all, that would be where you should tell me about it, so that they don't receive credit on something that they didn't do. Now, if every single person was amazing, wonderful, great, then let me know and you can all get 100 on that portion of your grade. The more people that do the survey, the more fair those grades become, and then I don't have to ask a group questions. Because last time I had a group in which only one member did the survey, and she said that she was the only one that did the project, and nobody else did it. And none of the other group members did the survey, so it's like, do I believe her? Because they didn't do it. So did they do anything at all? So I ended up having to have a conference with each member individually, and that's just time consuming and it takes me longer to grade your stuff then. You don't get your feedback back as fast. So the more people that do the survey, the easier and faster it is for me to get you guys your grades back. So keep that in mind. Once again, you can go ahead and do that whenever you want to, but you need to do that at the latest when you turn in your project. Any questions about that particular portion? Okay. All right then, we are going to go ahead and get started. Today we are going to move on to sculpture. Sculpture is similar to when we went over painting and drawing, in the sense that there are a whole bunch of different kinds of sculpture. And there's a lot of vocabulary word that comes along with it as well. So do you have a question? I'm gonna take it as a no. Okay. All right. So before we get started, I do want to give you guys that vocabulary, and then we're going to go over different examples of those words, and that's pretty much how today's lecture is going to be, is vocabulary in the lecture based around those words. So your first term for sculpture is freestanding. That means that that sculpture is alone by itself and you can walk all the way around it and see every single side of it. So a sculpture that is on a plinth or a pedestal is also considered freestanding because you can move around it and see all of the pieces or the sides of it. A relief sculpture is not freestanding. You cannot be a relief and freestanding at the same time. A relief sculpture is a sculpture that projects from a background, usually a wall. There's two kinds of reliefs. There's a low relief and a high relief. Low relief sculptures only slightly project from the background. The president's face on a penny, for example. Abraham Lincoln's face only slightly projects from that background. Usually, if less than half of the sculpture is projecting from the background, it is considered a low relief. High relief is when more than half of the sculpture projects from the background. So it might have some arms sticking out that aren't attached to the wall, or a leg, or a head. Modeling is when you add pliable materials to make your sculpture. So usually that's clay. With clay, it's moldable. You can model it. You can add more clay to it to make your sculpture. Considered an additive method of sculpture. So you're adding things to it. Now, before we move on, we're going to have a little bit of morning fun. I need 2 volunteers that are in the classroom. Anna, thank you. Who else? Okay, thank you. Okay, both of you, come here. And we got to do it in a spot that the people online can actually see, which is going to be in this general area. Anna, you get the easy job since you're the first one to volunteer. Can you illustrate to us what a freestanding sculpture would look like? You yourself are going to be the sculptor. Sure, why not? Is she correctly portraying a freestanding sculpture? Yeah, you just understand it. You understood it. Okay, you get the harder one, which is a high relief sculpture. Good job. Thank you. Can we do low relief sculpture with a person? No, why not? Can a person go halfway into the wall? No, so we cannot make a low relief sculpture with a person unless you've got some sort of a superpower that I don't know about. In that case, please step up. Okay, continuation now that we've kind of had our giggles for the morning and woken up a little bit more. Vocabulary. An armature is basically, think of an internal skeleton for a sculpture. It is usually a metal support system that helps hold up really heavy, large sculptures. Substitution is when you substitute one material for another. For example, if you were using bronze and then bronze was in short supply, you might want to substitute that for something else. A mold is something that you use in a bronze casting or a plaster casting process. It helps you make multiple copies of your sculpture. And carving is the opposite of modeling. Modeling is additive, where you're adding materials to it and molding. Carving is when you're removing or subtracting materials to create your sculpture. So think wood or marble. Once you take something off of wood or marble, you can't put it back on. So you probably could with glue, but there'd be a seam. And then I mentioned that word installation yesterday. Installation is when an artist transforms an entire space. And then our last vocabulary word is site-specific works. Sites are works that are created for a very specific place. Usually things like earthworks will fall under that category. Earthworks are works of art that are made with earth, particularly the landscape around it. And you can't move a lake into a gallery. That'd be weird. Probably could. It might be cool. It'd be really cool to have a lake inside of a gallery. I've seen a pool inside of a gallery before. They dyed it pink. Cool. Okay, now we're different examples, although we kind of already had fun with this one. Our first vocabulary word is freestanding sculpture. Once again, that's just a sculpture that can stand by itself. It's not attached to a wall or a background, and you can walk all the way around it, such as Martin Puryear's CFAO. Martin Puryear is an African-American sculptor who is really prominent in the art world today. He only works with wood, firstly, because his father had a wood shop business where he made furniture and he taught Martin how to do that. Secondly, because wood is considered primarily an African mode or traditional mode for creating art. We'll be looking at some African masks later on in this semester that are all wooden. So Martin Puryear tried to stay to his roots with that. So almost all of his sculptures are wooden, including the CFAO, which does have a reference to African masks in it as well. Another example of freestanding sculpture, we've already looked at this one. This is Martin Puryear's ladder for Booker T. Washington. You can walk all the way around it. It's not attached to anything. Now moving on from freestanding, because that one's probably the easiest one to grasp, to our low relief sculpture. Just a reminder, low relief sculpture means that less than half of it is projecting from a background that it's attached to. Once again, you see a freestanding sculpture and a relief, you're either one or the other. You can't be both. So here we see the Code of Hammurabi, which is less than halfway projecting from the background space there. Does anyone know anything about the Code of Hammurabi? Just me that was a crazy person when I took this class. Okay. So the Code of Hammurabi is the first set of like real laws that were ever created or that we know were created by the Sumerian culture, who were the first people to come up with a writing system, cuneiform. And when they did this, they made the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi is the man standing, and then the one in the seat is one of their gods. And this is basically their version of like Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. This is the God giving Hammurabi the Code of Hammurabi, which is, we could see it really close. We could see that the laws are down below written in it, the laws that say like an eye for an eye kind of thing. Rules for like your society to live by. So once again, this is a great example of a low relief sculpture. Less than half of it is projecting from the background. Any questions about why this is a low relief sculpture or questions about this in general? Nope. Okay. Here's another example of a low relief sculpture, except this one is recessed in versus sticking out. This is the stele of Akhenaten and his family. Akhenaten was an Egyptian pharaoh. We kind of get to talk about Akhenaten in this class, not too much, but he decides to completely change Egyptian everything. He was the only pharaoh that ever did that. He changed their god system, their art system, everything about them. So here we see the sun god Aten represented in the A, the sun and the rays, his wife and their daughters, and then him right there. And once again, this is halfway into or projecting, which classifies it as a low relief sculpture. Questions about this one? Are we going to ask why they look like aliens? Yeah, I know. So when Akhenaten was a pharaoh, he decided to get rid of the polytheism or worshiping a bunch of gods, and he wanted to just worship the sun god Aten. So he renamed himself after him even. He moved to the capital of Egypt to the new city of Akhenaten, once again named after himself and the sun god. He completely changed their art style. He's the only pharaoh to do that in the entirety of Egyptian history. All of the others liked to be portrayed as strong men. Akhenaten wanted to be ambiguous with his sexuality, so look kind of feminine and masculine in between, which is why they look a little bit like aliens, because he's trying to not be general with whether or not he's a man or a woman. Right after him comes his son, Tutankhamun, the really, really famous pharaoh, who changes everything back to before. But yeah, here's our other example of a low relief. I kind of chose stuff from a bunch of different ancient cultures. This is from the Greeks. This is from the Parthenon in Athens. This is the Panathenaic festival procession from the Parthenon's frieze. And once again, they are less than halfway projecting from the background there. This was just a long parade to go and give the statue of Athena new clothes. Every year they would have a little parade. A high relief sculpture is a sculpture that more than halfway projects from the background. So you can usually easily tell with ancient sculpture if something's over halfway projecting from the background if they're missing limbs, because it means those limbs were not even attached to the background. So here we see that this centaur has an arm missing and one of his horse's legs missing. That's because they weren't attached at all. They were just sticking out there. Same with this little Grecian man here. So another example of a high relief, they're more than halfway projecting from the background. You can tell that because of the large amount of shadows cast in the background. For example, this man here, his arm is clearly not attached from the back, and this is from the tomb of Emperor Augustus. And this dude here's lost his arm. Another Greek example of high relief. This is the Nike adjusting their sandal. Nikes kind of look like angels. They have wings. She's lost her arm, her wings, her head. That's because they were not attached to that background at all, meaning that background wasn't there to give her that support that she needed. So damage was likely to happen without that support there. Questions about high relief? We understand the difference between low and high relief. Oh, because people sometimes get confused on it. My people online, good. Modeling is an additive method, usually done with a pliable material such as clay or porcelain. It is also often done on a wheel or with a coil method. We're going to be talking about potter's wheels and coiling tomorrow when we go over craft media, because clay and ceramics for some reason falls under craft media. So this is an example of a Korean. This would have been made on a potter's wheel using a low fire clay, which is a soft moldable material. If you've used Play-Doh, that's like the kid version. It's very pliable and moldable, which is why we call it modeling. Another example of an artwork that was made with the modeling method is this archaic male Greek statue made with terracotta clay. Once again, clay, a soft, pliable material that you can mold with or model. So this is a life-size figure that was hand modeled and then baked and then painted. Once again, another example of modeling or something that you can make with the modeling method. Greek pottery. This is an example of black Greek pottery or black figure pottery because the people are black. They change it up later on to red figure pottery because the people are red. Clever names there. But both of these would have been made with a modeling method. Both of them were made on a potter's wheel. Moving on to our next vocabulary word, which is armature. Armatures are internal supports or internal skeletons for sculptures to help make them a little bit more durable and make them capable of standing on their own without the possibility of breaking. So here you see the internal support armature and what was modeled around it. So yes, you would have modeled this around that. So we're still using molding and modeling. But you're understanding why I said it's basically a skeleton system. Most often, armatures are used with really large sculptures like Viola Frey's Stubborn Woman Orange Hands. This sculpture is bigger than I am. Also, modeled clay is very dense and heavy. Therefore, if you were going to make something really, really large with clay, you would need some sort of support system to help keep everything from breaking or falling apart. So here you can even see the different pieces of clay that she put together. And you can just bracket these things together. You just have to leave holes in the clay before you bake it. And then you can wire those holes together to make this. Basically fill them up. But this does have an internal support system. Once again, it is an extremely large sculpture and it needs that support to not fall apart. Moving on from modeling and armatures to casting. Casting is the method of using molds to make multiple copies of something. So here you can see in the background the mold that was made to make this sculpture. So usually what you would do to make a mold is you would model with basically a Play-Doh-like substance, not clay, but something cheap and basic. You would mold your figure and then you would make your mold to make multiple copies. To do that, you would pour plaster around your model that you just created. And that plaster would harden. Then you would take your plaster in half, because usually you would do, okay, this is where it gets complicated. Let me explain this correctly. So you'd have like your plastic tub and you could fill it with plaster and then I would stick that like face down to do the first half and let that dry. And then you would take it out and then you do the same thing for the back half. And then you put the two halves together after you like file them down and make them fit. And that's how you would get something like this. You have to do your molds in sections. Even this one would actually technically take more than two usually to come up with your final mold because of the hand, you don't want them breaking off. So there is your mold, and molds once again are used to make multiple copies. Think back to our printmaking section. The hard part is making your stencil for things in printmaking, and then you can make your multiple copies. Same thing with casting with multiple copies. The hard part is making your mold for casting. Once you get that mold made, you can easily make multiple copies and make more money off of it. Moving on from casting to substitution, which by the way, this was made with a casting method, a method called the lost wax casting method that we're going to watch a video on in a second. But here we have a great example of substitution. So this particular sculpture is made of bronze. And you remember how I mentioned earlier, what if bronze is in short supply? Well, then you'd have to use something else to make this. That's where marble comes into play. So if you're not familiar with Greek history or Roman history, you might not be aware, but partway through Greek history, Rome conquers them and they become part of the Roman Empire. At this point, Rome is in the process of conquering a whole bunch of land, and they are needing bronze to make armor and weapons and spears and things like that. So what they do with the bronze statues that they find when they conquered Greece is they melt them down. But before they melt down those statues, they make a whole bunch of marble copies. Marble was a stone, it was in plentiful supply. So they could easily use the marble and substitute marble for those bronze statues so that they could repurpose that bronze. So almost all of the Greek statues that we know today that are in marble would have originally been in bronze. They're not actually supposed to be marble. And you can always tell if it's a Roman copy in marble if it has a stupid little stump or rock or little things bracing different limbs together. That's because marble is a lot heavier and bronze is hollow inside. So you would not need those supports. Whereas with the marble, you do need those supports so they don't break. So a great example of substitution here. The Romans needed the bronze to continue their conquest. So they substituted the bronze with marble. Here's another Roman copy. Once again, you can tell that because there's a little rock there that would not have originally been there. Now we're going to move on to our lost wax casting method. This goes along with casting, the idea of being able to make multiple copies of things. However, with the lost wax casting method, we don't really use that one anymore because you can only make one copy and that kind of defeats the purpose of casting. And we are going to watch a shorter video. It says lost wax. It's not like we lost it or we forgot how to do it. It's just that we have better ways of casting today. So we don't use that one very much.
Much of what we know about the culture of ancient civilizations is through depictions that survive in their bronze sculpture. These sculptures were created with the lost wax process thousands of years ago. The lost wax process is more sophisticated today, but it essentially remains the same as it was in 2000 BC. Most modern sculptors work with a fine arts foundry and its staff of experts to have their pieces cast in bronze. Once the artist completes the original, which is usually modeled in clay, plaster, or wax, the original piece must be molded. The mold consists of two basic parts, an inner layer usually of a flexible silicone rubber, supported by a rigid protective mother mold of plaster or fiberglass. The mold is engineered to separate in two or more parts, thus releasing the original artwork. When the mold is rejoined after the original artwork has been removed, an exact negative image of the original exists. The next step is to pour wax into this mold to create a positive wax replica of the original artwork. This petroleum-based wax is melted at about 210 degrees. It is poured into the mold, rotated so all surfaces are covered, and the excess is poured out. Pours are repeated to achieve a thickness of about 3/16 inch in wax. When cooled, the mold is opened and a wax replica is removed. Wax chasing is the next stage of the process. This delicate process consists of removing seam lines created where the mold separates, repairing imperfections such as air bubbles, and reattaching any parts that had to be cut off during the molding process. This is done with heated soldering irons and special tools. The completed wax must look exactly like the artist's original sculpture. At this point, the wax is ready to be sprued. Wax bars or channels are attached to the piece to create pathways through which the molten bronze will travel to the artwork. Wax vents and gates are also attached to the wax sculpture to aid metal flow and allow gas to escape. All the wax will eventually become negative space later in the process, which will ultimately be replaced by bronze. The ceramic shell process begins by dipping the sprued wax into vats of liquid slurry, followed immediately by a bath of sand. This process builds a thin wall of silica around the wax. This is repeated until a shell approximately 1/2 inch in thickness forms around the wax. When dry, the shells are now inverted and placed into an autoclave to be dewaxed, eliminating the positive space taken up by the wax, and thus creating a cavity or negative space for the bronze to occupy. A large crucible fired by a furnace is filled with bronze ingots and melted. The metal begins to melt at approximately 1700.
So in case you missed it, they made the wax sculpture, wax melts. They covered that wax sculpture in basically a ceramic shell and baked it. When they baked it, that wax melted out. So now they have that ceramic shell that they can pour bronze into, because we're wanting to make a bronze sculpture here. So now they're heating up the bronze.
100 degrees. The ceramic shells at this time are also heated in a kiln to approximately 1100 degrees.
You don't want to put really, really hot stuff in something cold, because it's going to break. So they have to heat up the ceramic shells that they just made to a sufficient temperature before they pour in that molten bronze so that it doesn't crack the shell.
Degrees to aid the flow of the bronze. When all temperatures are reached, the shells are removed from the kiln and the molten bronze is poured into the shells. When cool enough to handle, hammers and chisels are used to knock the shell off of the solidified metal. Gates and...
So we made the wax figure, we made the shell, and now we're breaking the shell. So you cannot reuse that shell. So you only get one and done with this one, which is why it's considered the lost wax casting method, and we don't use it anymore.
Screws are also cut off. Lastly, the piece is sandblasted to remove the fine remaining shell from the bronze. The bronze must now have all imperfections repaired and any parts welded back on that were cut off during the spruing process. once again making an exact reproduction of the artist's original sculpture. Pneumatic tools are used to recreate these subtle surfaces. If internal support is needed, it is added now. The final step in this process is applying the patina to the bronze. This process enhances the surface by creating color through the application of various chemicals, which are applied at a high heat with the use of a torch gun. When the desired effect is achieved, a thin coat of clear wax is applied to the surface to enhance and preserve the patina. As you can see, the lost wax casting process is lengthy and labor-intensive, requiring the collaboration and expertise of many. Knowledge of this process.
So you might have caught on that that's actually a factory that's doing that. It's not the artists themselves. That's pretty common these days. If an artist is wanting a bronze sculpture made, it's pretty rare for them to do it themselves. Sometimes you'll come across an artist that will do it themselves. But most often they will just send off that modeled figure or sculpture to the little factory or studio that specializes in this and let them do it. So lost wax casting method was really popular in ancient societies. Like I mentioned, that Greek charioteer would have been made using the lost wax casting method. This Egyptian cat was also made using the lost wax casting method. But you can see the downside with that method is that you only get one sculpture and then you got to start over again, and it's a long process. And the whole point of casting is so that you can make multiple copies. So that kind of defeats the purpose there. So new casts today are using newer materials such as plastics and resins with their castings. So a great example of that is Rachel Whiteread. Rachel Whiteread likes to use things like plastics and concrete with her castings. And in Untitled Hive 1, she filled a beekeeper's hive with polyresin and let it harden. So her cast was the beekeeper's hive, and then the sculpture was the resin that was left over. Because she used that resin, she was able to get something that is a bit of a double entendre with this here. So she used a beekeeper's hive to make hive 1. What does it look like? It looks like honey, yes. So she used that polyresin and it was able to give an effect that looks like honey, which is what bees make. What else? What does the thing look like overall? If I didn't tell you it was a hive, a house. This is a house where the bees live, so that makes sense. Rachel Whiteread likes to do houses a lot. She is a British artist and she lives in central London. If you're not familiar, there's a bit of a housing crisis going on there, meaning there's not enough houses for people. And the houses that are available there are extremely expensive and overpriced because it's the city. So she likes to make statements on that by making houses that nobody can live in. For example, she took an empty lot in central London and poured a solid concrete house with no doors or windows. So she's like, I was able to make a house in this empty lot. You guys say that we don't have enough housing, make use of the land that we do have. But she made it an unlivable house because even if there was a house there, it'd be too expensive for anyone to live there. But that's just a statement on housing situations, and a lot of contemporary artists do like to make statements on things. Now, moving on from modeling and casting to carving. Carving is a subtractive method of sculpting. So with this one, you are using a hard, non-pliable material such as, once again, wood or marble to carve and chisel out your sculpture. Here we see Michelangelo's Awakening Slaves. He didn't give them that title. It was given to them later. These are unfinished sculptures by Michelangelo. Do you guys think that's a good name? Yes, no, maybe. Most people say yeah. Why? Awakening Slaves. Why say they're awakening? Yeah, they're kind of like starting to wake up from the stone. Why call them slaves? Oh no. Because they're a slave to the stone still. They're still in the stone. They aren't fully out. So Michelangelo, once again, I've said this many times, considered himself to be a sculptor first and foremost. However, he ended up spending a good chunk of his free time painting the Sistine ceiling and the Sistine chapel and doing stuff for a pope and the pope's tomb and a bunch of other things for that particular pope. And he never got to finish the stuff that he wanted to finish. Because when the Pope tells you you have to do something, you have to do something. You're not allowed to refuse it, especially back during the Renaissance period. So these are his unfinished sculptures. When Michelangelo got a piece of marble, first off, he wasn't your normal artist. Most artists will just have a marble piece delivered to them and then they start carving it. Michelangelo would go to the quarries himself and pick out his own marble because he felt like there were things trapped in it, which is another reason why they're called awakening slaves. Michelangelo felt like there were people trapped inside of the marble and it was his job to get them out and free them. So he would go to those quarries and stare at a whole bunch of pieces of marble and figure out which ones he needed to free. Yeah. Which is another reason why they are called awakening slaves, because he felt like he was freeing them from their traps. And these guys never got freed, unfortunately. Another example of carving is carving with jade. So beyond just marble or wood that we've discussed, you can also use jade or precious stones or precious metals and things like that to carve with. Of course, primarily you will see jade used in Eastern art. Although I was listening to a podcast the other day and there was someone that was saying that there was a jade piece that was carved in England, which is kind of interesting because you don't really find jade in England. It's more than a Chinese thing. Once again, another example of carving is wood. Basically, if you're using something that's harder and you're taking stuff away from it to make it, then you're probably carving. Moving on from carving to constructions. Constructions mean we're talking about welding things together. So putting different pieces together and attaching them. The first artist to implement the welding method was Julio Gonzalez. And he would use a welding torch to create his sculptures. This is a great example of, yet again, another freestanding sculpture. It is all by itself. It's not attached to anything. And this is a woman. You guys make it up. It's obviously an abstract interpretation of a woman. She has hair and a head. What is she doing? She is sitting, yes. She is sitting down. So you can see he used welding to attach these different metals together in order to create this abstract woman with her hair and her head and body. And of course, a lot of other artists are using welding today, such as Melvin Edwards. Melvin Edwards is really popular right now. He is from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is nice to see. We don't see very many artists from Texas these days. What do these things look like to you? Door handles, maybe. Remember, he's from Texas. It has to do with Texas. The things that are popular in Texas. They represent wall mounts, guys. Like if you go hunting, you shoot a deer and then you mount it. Yeah. Yeah. So they're like different animals. This one's like a pig and an elephant. And I have yet to figure out what these two are supposed to be, but this is a pig and an elephant. You can also see references to Texas in the horseshoe and various other objects in the little sculptures. These are not freestanding. They are attached to a wall because wall mounts are. So they are high relief sculptures. Melvin Edwards is going to pop up later on too when we get to installations. But our last bit of sculpture that we're going to talk about is kinetic sculpture. Kinetic sculpture is sculpture that moves. We talked about that with Alexander Calder and his mobiles towards the beginning of the semester, but that's been a hot minute. Here's what those look like. So they react to the wind around them and they start moving. They're very large sculptures that hang from the ceiling and spin around. Another sculpture, which I did not remember to get the video ready for, is Theo Jansen's. Theo Jansen is a crazy person, or he just has a really good sense of humor. I haven't quite figured out which. But he makes animals. He makes animals. Let that sink in. I should probably
Dropbox. For all things work, all in one place.
I would like to tell you about a project which I started about 16 years ago, and it's about making new forms of life. And these are made of this kind of tube, electricity tube, they call it in Holland. And we can start a film about that, and we can see a little bit backwards in time.
Eventually, these beasts are going to live in herds on the beaches. Theo Jansen is working hard on this evolution.
I want to put this forms of life on the beaches, and they should survive over there on their own in the future. Learning to live on their own, and it will take a couple of more years to let them walk on their own.
The mechanical beasts will not get their energy from food, but from the wind. The wind will move feathers on their back, which will drive their feet. The beast walks sideways on the wet sand of the beach, with its nose pointed into the wind. As soon as it walks into either the rolling surf or the dry sand, it stops and walks in the opposite direction. Evolution has generated many species. This is the
Whoops. We froze. Well, you get the gist of it. They're pretty cool. They move by themselves now. You saw the beginning where he was having to drag it. Now they entirely walk on their own and they're just propelled by the wind, which is really cool to see in person. I saw a miniature one one day in London, which was awesome. I didn't know what it was then. Now I do. Wish I did know what it was then. Interesting guy though, and a great example once again of kinetic sculpture. So sculptures that move on their own. Of course, like he said, he's trying to make animals. I don't know if he truly believes that or if it's just a joke, but it does take a bit of a brilliant mind to come up with the idea of how to do that, because it's way more advanced than our first example of kinetic sculpture with all of its parts. Now, our next form of sculpture is mixed media. We have talked about this word before. It's just using more than one medium in your art piece. So for example, here we have a stool and a bicycle wheel. This is a mixed media art piece made by the artist Marcel Duchamp, who is a member of the Dada movement. We talked about them before too. They were trying to show off the absurdity of World War I in their art pieces. So they made some pretty absurd artwork, which we see here in what Marcel Duchamp called a ready-made. Get it? It was already made. Just put it together. Here is another example of mixed media and someone who was inspired by Marcel Duchamp. This is Robert Rauschenberg. Robert Rauschenberg was part of the contemporary post-World War II art movement. You can see he was obviously inspired by the Dada artist because he uses the word Dada several times in the canvas on the ground. And this is his monogram. Fun fact, I think I might have said this before, but Robert Rauschenberg is the most famous artist from Texas ever. What we have contributed. So what this is it's a painted canvas, which instead of displaying it on the wall, he has laid it on the ground. He has nailed pieces of wood, once again, that say Dada to it. He found in the dumpster a goat and covered it in paint and put a tire around it, also found in the dumpster, and called it art. Because once again, he was inspired by this guy. So you can see how. This is called an assemblage, though, not a ready-made. Assemblage, and the fact that it's an assembly of different things put together. And Robert Rauschenberg is pretty much the only one that calls it that. Moving on from mixed media sculptures to installations. Installations and site-specific works, they don't quite fit into the sculptures section, but they're newer, so they don't really have enough context to have their own chapters yet. We're going to come across that several times. For example, happenings in performance art are also new, therefore they don't have their own chapter yet, but they probably fall more under theater arts than they do visual. But installations, just a reminder, are art pieces that take up an entire space. This is an installation by Melvin Edwards, and it uses barbed wire. Once again, Melvin Edwards is a Texas artist. Barbed wire is a Texas thing. So here you see a hoop, and once again in a circle hanging from the ceiling, and it looks like there's more space behind you in this gallery, but no, that's the entire space. It's a very small gallery. So the art piece took up the entire space. Another example of an installation or an art piece that takes up or transforms the entire room is this one. This was created by some California art students for their senior program, and it is a room filled with hot Cheetos. Makes sense. And then on the wall are just different bags of hot Cheetos, or what was the bag cover at that time. And some boxes of hot Cheetos, like those large 48-count boxes. Yeah. There was a better version of this done like right after, where they literally filled the room with hot Cheetos. Like you couldn't even walk in the room because it was just hot Cheetos on the ground for like a few feet deep, which is cool. Here's another example of an installation. This is Key in the Hand from Chiyoda. This was done for the Venice Biennale. They not only made this a visual experience, but they also had a bit of an auditory experience to go
Writing's
along
not that easy.
with. And I'll give them time to show this anyway. So this is the entrance to that building. And they did have this music playing in the background. But you get the gist. The entire space was transformed. For those of you that might not be aware, the Venice Biennale is basically the Olympics for art. Every country submits their artists that they want to represent them. And then that artist goes and transforms the pavilion for that country. This is the Japanese pavilion from the 2015 Venice Biennale. And what it was red strings with keys attached to them. It has to do with a proverb. And then in the background, you heard the Buddhist monk chanting, which sounded creepy, but it's not supposed to be. It's actually a positive, happy thing, which is the idea that you can always find your way home, which is what this proverb is generally about. So the keys represent home. And then the strings are the different avenues in life, but if you follow your string, you'll find your way home kind of thing, which is cute, I think anyways. Might just be. And then this pavilion did not win that year, because like I said, it's a competition. So there is a winner. This one did not win. The next one. Moving on from installations to site-specific. Site-specific artworks are artworks made for that specific site. They do not work in another setting. Oftentimes earthworks will fall under that site-specific work category. Earthworks are artworks made using earth. Very clever name there. So this is a site-specific earthwork called Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. It is located in Salt Lake City, Utah, or right outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. You can go to it. It's free. Most people don't know it even exists. It's in the middle of one of the salt lakes. But you can go and walk out on the little path there and enjoy it. Sometimes it is underwater because that's how water works, depending on what time of year you're going. What this actually is, though, is it creates a safe ecosystem for the krill to reproduce in. So during certain times of the year, like I said, the water is over the sculpture, allowing the krill easy access into it. They will nest there, and then they will vacate. So it kind of protects them from natural predators so that they can have their babies safely. Robert Smithson does like to create environmentally friendly works. Would this artwork work in some random lake? No. Why not? Yeah, he made it specifically for this particular lake. It's not going to work in a different one. It has to be at a certain level, certain temperatures. It has to be able to function the way it's supposed to function. And if we move it and drop it into some lake down in Texas, it's not going to work. Here's another example of a site-specific work. This is not an earthwork. It does not use earth, but I think you can probably tell this. This is John Claude and Christo's wrappings. John Claude and Christo are a husband and wife duo that wrap things in fabric. Why would this be site-specific? Very good. Yes. So this is a bridge located in Germany. They had to measure out the specific lengths for the fabrics and the cords and wires wrapping it. There's not an exact bridge like that anywhere else. So the wrappings wouldn't fit another bridge unless they altered them. So this is very site specific. Another example of Jean Claude and Christo's wrappings. This is the Florida Keys wrappings. These were only up for a few days because they started killing fish. But why are these site specific? It's around that specific piece of land. They were obviously made for each key. They had to measure out for every single one of these individual keys. There's some down here too. To figure out what shape that fabric needs to be in the length and dimensions. So very specific. Our last site-specific artwork is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. This one does require a little bit more context than the others. Tilted Arc was made for an office building. They had a very large courtyard in New York and they wanted an art piece to fill it up. So they asked Richard Serra, who's a pretty prominent contemporary sculptor, to make them an art piece for the courtyard so they could enjoy it during their lunchtime hour. And he came up with Tilted Arc, made specifically for that courtyard. The dimensions of Tilted Arc fit that space. It's a very, very large art piece for a very large courtyard. However, this art piece was removed shortly thereafter because people didn't like having to walk around it. It took them extra time to go to and from the office building because they had to walk around the art piece. The other reason why the art piece was removed is that homeless people were using it as like a wind shelter. So depending on which way the wind was blowing, they could use it as kind of a little shelter to hide themselves from it. So they didn't like that either. So this art piece is now in storage somewhere and Richard Serra has not exhibited it since, because it was made for that specific place and he refuses to show it anywhere else. So that takes us actually to the end of our sculpture section. We covered a lot of things with sculpture today, including some things that weren't really sculptures like installations and site specific. But once again, that's because they didn't have their own category yet because they're newer. But we went over freestanding, reliefs, both high and low, casting, modeling, carving, mixed media, and kinetic sculptures, as well as a few others. So we covered quite a bit. Tomorrow we are going to kind of start off a little bit with some more sculptures. We're going to start off tomorrow with ceramics, which are a form of modeling. So we can go on with that and we can learn how people actually make those ceramic pieces if you're not familiar. As for the rest of today, you guys have about 17 minutes. You might want to work on some of your project. Once again, that is due on Friday. You might want to go ahead and do your group survey. I don't know, that's up to you. You might want to give your fellow group members a little bit of chance to redeem themselves. I don't know, that's your own personal opinion. I will leave that up to you. Those of you that are online, give me a second to check in people that came late. Okay, every single person is here today. There is nobody absent. So if you're trying to get a hold of someone, today would be it. Meaning blurt out your question and ask them now. Anyone need to talk to anybody? Everyone has gotten into contact with all of their people. Okay. I don't want to hear this. They didn't ever talk to me because you have a chance to talk to them right now. Brittany, you have a question?
No, more of a comment. I mean, I agree, but I disagree. I mean, if communication's been put out there multiple times, I mean, at some point it's their responsibility.
I agree, but there's one last push. So just a reminder, this group project is a major grade in this class, so you do need to be working on that.